The whispers began long before the wedding day. In a small town, rumors moved like smoke, slipping under doors, curling around dinner tables, clinging to people's clothes. And in this case, the smoke carried a cruel question. Will her father even be there? It wasn't a question of logistics. It was a question of pride. Her father, Daniel, had raised her alone since the day she was born. He wasn't the kind of man who turned heads when he entered a room. His hands were rough. His back was bent from years of lifting crates in warehouses, scrubbing dishes in diners, fixing the leaky roofs of neighbors who rarely said thank you. He didn't own a house big enough to host holidays. He didn't have a car shiny enough to drive the bride in. What he did have was a life stitched together with sacrifices, unseen, unpraised, and often unremembered. But to the relatives who only showed up on Christmas or weddings, he was just that poor man who never made much of himself. And so, as the invitations went out, some noticed that Daniel's name was missing from the list of honored guests. Not the officiant, not the one giving the bride away, not even seated at the family table near the stage. It was as if the man who had carried the weight of her childhood had been quietly erased. On the morning of the rehearsal dinner, one of the cousins muttered over coffee, "It's probably for the best. He'd embarrass her. Can you imagine him standing up there in that old suit of his?" Another nodded. "The groom's family is well off. They don't need to see that kind of tragedy." They said it with a shrug, as though a father's love could be measured in the shine of his shoes. But love does not shout its own worth. It does not carry receipts in its pocket, ready to defend itself. Love works silently, like a candle burning down over the years, its flame small, steady, and often overlooked. But the only reason the room is not in darkness. Daniel knew about the whispers. He wasn't deaf. He saw the way relatives smirked when he entered a room. He saw how they looked at his shoes, his shirt, the calluses on his hands. And yet, he never defended himself. He never told them how many nights he skipped dinner so his daughter could eat. He never revealed how he once sold his wedding ring to cover her school books. He never reminded anyone of the hospital nights, when only his hand held her steady through fever. He just smiled, that quiet smile of men who love without needing applause. But weddings are different. Weddings are public. They are a stage, and every family becomes an audience. So when the rehearsal seating chart was revealed and his name wasn't there, some were surprised. Others were not. "That's just how it is," someone whispered. "Times have changed," another said. Besides, maybe she asked for it. The thought stung more than Daniel would ever admit. What if his daughter truly didn't want him there? He folded the paper quietly. He didn't argue. He didn't fight. He only nodded, thanked the planner, and walked home in silence. That night he sat at the edge of his bed, staring at an old photograph. His daughter was 6, her missing front tooth making her smile crooked and perfect. She was sitting on his shoulders, her tiny hands gripping his forehead, squealing with laughter. He whispered almost to himself, "Do you remember, sweetheart? Do you remember who carried you?" The photo, of course, did not answer, but the memory wrapped around him, warm and painful. He had been there for every scraped knee, every school play, every late-night call of "Daddy, I can't sleep." He had stitched costumes out of old sheets, cooked pancakes shaped like hearts, learned how to braid hair with clumsy fingers. And now, on the day she would walk into a new life, it seemed he would walk into the shadows. But here is the truth about fathers like Daniel. They may be quiet, they may be overlooked, they may be dismissed as embarrassing or not enough. Yet inside them lives a strength that does not break, even when ignored. As Daniel folded the photograph back into its worn frame, he whispered again, "No matter what tomorrow brings, I will always be her father." He stood, adjusted his old suit hanging by the closet door, and closed his eyes for a moment. Outside, the town buzzed with wedding excitement. Inside, a father's heart prepared for a day that might celebrate everyone but him. But he knew something the others did not. He carried a truth that no cousin, no planner, no guest list could erase. And the day of the wedding, that truth would finally be seen. In families, love is supposed to be the currency. But in Daniel's family, the exchange rate was skewed. Respect was handed out not for kindness, but for bank accounts. Worth was tallied not by sacrifice, but by square footage and last names. And in that cruel economy, Daniel was always in debt. The gatherings were the hardest. Thanksgiving, Easter, birthdays that rotated from one cousin's home to another. Daniel would arrive with his daughter carrying a pie he had baked himself, the crust slightly uneven, the filling sometimes spilling over. He'd smile shyly, place it on the crowded dessert table, and step back. The comments came quick, though rarely to his face. Store-bought would have been better. Does he even know what he's doing in a kitchen? Or the one that always stung most, poor child growing up with just him. Laughter would ripple like clinking glasses while Daniel pretended not to hear. It wasn't just words. It was the way space rearranged itself around him. At dinners, he was placed at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door, as if proximity to the food might disguise the absence of his status. When family photos were taken, he was nudged to the edge, his shoulders barely inside the frame. Even his clothes became a target. His jacket, clean but worn thin, drew eyes that darted and smirked. His shoes, polished but cracked, seemed louder in their silence than any insult. The cruelest part was not the mocking, it was the dismissal. To them, Daniel wasn't someone to fight with. He was someone to overlook. But his daughter noticed. Children always notice. At age 10, she once squeezed his hand under the table when an uncle joked about her having to play both parents in her school skits. At age 14, she leaned her head against his arm when an aunt remarked, "She'll grow up fast with no mother around." And at 17, when the whispers grew sharper about college, about weddings, about how will he manage, she began to argue back. Yet Daniel would gently hush her. "Let it go, sweetheart," he would murmur, because he knew how family works. Retaliation only made the whispers louder. The truth was, he did not blame them for their wealth or their comfort. He only wished they could see beyond it. On winter mornings, when he walked to work before sunrise, the cold biting his skin raw, he thought of how different his life looked from theirs. They awoke in heated houses, brewed coffee in stainless steel machines, and drove to offices in warm cars. He trudged through icy sidewalks to load trucks, his breath the only fog rising in the dawn. By the time they opened emails, his back already ached. By the time they sat down to lunch, his shirt was damp with sweat. And by the time they discussed stock portfolios or vacation plans at family dinners, his fingernails still held traces of grease from a second shift at the mechanics. It wasn't envy. It was exhaustion and the quiet wish that someone, anyone, might look past the grime and see the devotion underneath. Still, he endured. He learned how to smile at insults, how to laugh when excluded, how to disappear in plain sight, because his daughter needed him too. Every dollar he made, every humiliation he swallowed was folded into the fabric of her life. The ballet lessons she begged for as a child, the braces she wore in middle school, the college applications that came with fees as heavy as rent. He gave her everything they believed he couldn't. And yet, in the eyes of his family, he remained the man with nothing. One particular evening lingered in his memory. It was a summer barbecue, the air thick with charcoal smoke and the smell of grilled meat. Music played from a speaker, children ran barefoot on the grass. Daniel stood alone near the fence, a paper plate balanced in his hand. A cousin walked by, whispering just loud enough for others to hear. "Strange, isn't it? He's never remarried. Maybe no woman would have him." The laughter that followed was small but sharp, like the sting of a wasp, quick and dismissive. Daniel looked down at his plate. The burger had gone cold. Moments like that stacked on each other over the years until the weight was almost unbearable. Yet he never let his daughter see the crack in his armor. To her, he was steady, dependable, the one who never faltered. To the rest of them, he was invisible. And so, as the wedding approached, their disdain grew bolder. He overheard an aunt say to another, "I just hope he doesn't make a scene." Can you imagine him standing next to the groom's family? The words settled heavy in his chest. Not because they surprised him, but because he realized they had already written him out of the story. In their version, he was a footnote, a shadow at the edge of photographs, a man tolerated, never honored. What they did not know, what none of them could have guessed, was that Daniel had been preparing for this day in silence. And the moment would come when silence would end. Long before the whispers, before the seating charts and the mocking glances, there was only one thing that defined Daniel's life. A tiny cry in the middle of a hospital night. He remembered it vividly. The fluorescent lights flickered above, the linoleum floor cold beneath his tired feet. The doctor placed a bundle into his arms, smaller than anything he had ever held. Her skin was soft as silk, her breath quick, uneven like a bird testing its wings. He named her Emily, and in that moment the rest of the world blurred. The marriage had already been unraveling by then. His wife was restless, eager for a life Daniel could never give her: city lights, polished restaurants, travel that stretched beyond bus routes and overtime paychecks. When she left, Emily was barely 6 months old. She packed a single suitcase and walked out without turning back. Daniel stood in the doorway, his daughter in his arms, watching taillights fade into the distance. He did not beg, he did not chase. His silence wasn't pride, it was surrender to the truth he already knew. What she sought he could not offer, what Emily needed he could, so he closed the door, and from that day forward he was both father and mother, provider and protector, teacher and comforter. It wasn't easy. He abandoned dreams without ceremony. Once he had been offered a promotion at the warehouse, longer hours, more money, but it required travel out of town for weeks at a time. He declined. He couldn't leave a baby alone, not even with babysitters who smelled of smoke and impatience. Friends invited him to poker nights, to weekends away, to fishing trips. He always said no, not because he didn't crave the laughter, but because Emily's bedtime was at 8 and she cried if he wasn't there to hum her to sleep. Romance, too, slipped away. There were women who smiled at him at church, women who admired his quiet strength, but he could never ask them to carry the weight he had chosen. His life, from that moment on, belonged to Emily. There were nights when he thought the sacrifice might break him. He would come home bone-tired, the smell of motor oil clinging to his skin, his shoulders heavy from lifting crates. Emily would be crying in her crib, hungry, restless. He'd set down his lunchbox, still full, and rock her gently until her sobs softened. Only then would he eat cold leftovers, sitting in silence with the hum of the refrigerator as company. Winters were hardest. The furnace in their small rental house rattled more than it warmed. He would wake at 3 a.m. to check on her, slipping extra blankets over her tiny body, his own breath fogging in the chill. He often went without gloves, telling her when she was older, "Daddy's hands don't get cold." The truth was, his fingers burned in the frost, but he saved every spare dollar for her coat, her shoes, her future. And yet, scattered among the exhaustion were moments of pure light. The first time Emily said "Daddy," her voice still clumsy, the word tumbling out like a stone skipping on water. He felt it ripple through him, stronger than any paycheck, greater than any applause. The afternoons they spent in the park, Emily chasing pigeons while Daniel clapped and cheered, ignoring the odd looks of parents who wondered why a man in steel-toed boots bothered to sit on the swings. The evenings when she would crawl into his lap, sticky with peanut butter, and fall asleep against his chest while cartoons flickered across the screen. Those were the treasures he hoarded, priceless, unseen, yet more real than anything the family measured him by. Still, the weight of being alone carved itself into him. He remembered one particular morning. Emily, maybe 8 years old, needed supplies for a school project: cardboard, glue, colored paper. The money in his wallet was barely enough for groceries. He stared at the items in the store aisle, heart racing with the familiar calculation of cost. He chose the glue and paper, left the bread behind. For dinner that night he made do with rice and beans. Emily never noticed. She proudly carried her project to class, a castle of paper and tape that looked fragile but felt to Daniel sturdier than any stone. He told himself as he watched her smile, "This is what matters. This is why." Over the years, those sacrifices accumulated quietly, like rings inside a tree trunk. No one saw them, but they told the story of his life. And while the rest of his family measured success by bank accounts and shiny cars, Daniel measured his by the curve of Emily's smile, the sound of her laughter, the way she reached for his hand in a crowd. He had given up everything else: dreams, comfort, companionship. But in exchange he had gained her. And for Daniel there was no comparison. Money has a sound. It is the clink of coins counted too many times, the rustle of bills that never seem thick enough, the hollow echo of an empty wallet snapped shut. For Daniel, it was a sound that followed him like a shadow. Every month brought a new bill, another envelope slipped through the slot, its thin paper carrying the weight of dread. Rent, utilities, groceries, and on top of those the extras that never felt like extras when raising a child: shoes that no longer fit, field trip fees, a doctor's prescription for a stubborn cough. It wasn't just math. It was a constant question: what can I give up so she doesn't have to? He became an expert at stretching meals, stretching paychecks, stretching hope. A single chicken could last a week if cooked 3 different ways. A gallon of milk was watered down on the third day to make it last until payday. When Emily was little, she never noticed. To her, pancakes for dinner felt like a treat, not a necessity. Macaroni with only butter seemed like comfort food, not compromise. She smiled through it all while Daniel carried the weight in silence. Medical bills carved the deepest wounds. One winter, Emily caught a severe flu. Her fever climbed past reason, her breathing ragged, her small body trembling in his arms. He rushed her to the emergency room, where the harsh smell of antiseptic burned his nose and the fluorescent lights washed every face pale. They saved her, thank God, but the weeks that followed brought envelopes stamped in red. Balance due. Numbers larger than his entire month's pay stared back at him from the page. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table of his small rented apartment late at night, head in his hands, the bills spread like a storm before him. The steady ticking of the wall clock was the only sound, and even that felt mocking, reminding him that time itself was another debt he could not repay. School added its own demands. When Emily reached high school, there were dances, team fees, textbooks heavier in price than in weight. Teachers sent home lists of required materials, each item small but relentless in their accumulation. Daniel would nod, smile, and tell her, "We'll figure it out." Then he'd clock in for an extra shift, dragging himself through hours that left his muscles screaming. He sold old tools, pawned his watch, even once parted with a guitar he had played since he was a teenager. Emily never knew. To her, the supplies appeared on the table as if by magic, her father's tired eyes disguised by a smile. The hardest part wasn't hunger or exhaustion. It was the moments of saying no. There was a year when Emily begged for summer camp. Her friends were going, canoes, bonfires, songs sung under starlight. She talked about it for weeks, her excitement spilling out at breakfast, at bedtime, in the car. Daniel wanted to say yes. He wanted it more than anything. But the numbers on the brochure were impossible. He remembers her silence when he told her they couldn't afford it. She didn't cry. She just nodded, forced a small smile, and said, "That's okay, Daddy, maybe next year." Her voice was kind, but her eyes lingered too long on the floor. That image stayed with him longer than any overdue notice. Debt became a language he learned against his will. He memorized the cycle of minimum payments, the sharp tone of collection calls, the way interest grew like weeds in a garden he could never fully tend. There were nights he worked 2 jobs, stumbling home when the sky was already light. His body craved sleep, but the mailbox waited. He'd shuffle through it, holding his breath, bracing for the next reminder that he was falling behind. Still, he never let Emily see. To her, he was simply tired. To him, he was a man carrying mountains and pretending they were pebbles. Yet amidst the crushing weight, there was also a strange kind of grace. Because every sacrifice, every bill paid late, every meal skipped, became a thread in the tapestry of her life. She grew, unaware of the invisible cost. Her laughter filled the apartment, her report cards brightened the refrigerator door, her footsteps echoed down hallways that bills had nearly taken away. Daniel bore the burden so she could live without knowing one existed. And though the numbers never stopped pressing down, he carried them willingly. For him, love was not measured in what he had. It was measured in what he gave away. The wedding was drawing near, and with it came a flurry of advice, most of it uninvited. Relatives descended like moths to a porch light, their voices soft but insistent, their words cloaked in care yet heavy with contempt. Emily found herself surrounded by opinions that seemed less about celebration and more about control. It began innocently enough, or so it seemed. An aunt leaned across the kitchen counter one afternoon, lowering her voice as if confiding a secret. "Sweetheart," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee, "this is the most important day of your life. You want everything perfect, don't you?" Emily nodded. Who wouldn't? The aunt's eyes flicked toward the window where Daniel was in the yard mending a loose fence post with his weathered hands. She sighed. "Your father, he means well, but maybe you should think about how it will look. A wedding is not just about love. It's about families coming together. Appearances matter." The message sank in like a drop of ink in water. Subtle, spreading. Soon others added their voices. A cousin called late one night, her tone wrapped in false sympathy. "You've done so well for yourself, Emily. College, a good job, marrying into a family that's respected. You don't want anything to cast a shadow on that. People talk, you know. And your dad, well, people remember things. Emily frowned into the darkness of her room. Remember what? What was it they thought they knew? But the cousin quickly changed the subject, as if the remark were casual, harmless. The seed, however, was already planted. At dress fittings, at family dinners, in hurried whispers before church, the refrain repeated in different forms. He might draw attention. He doesn't know how to behave at these things. Your groom's parents might feel uncomfortable. The voices were hushed, always hushed, as though they were protecting her from some shame she hadn't yet noticed herself. No one spoke of Daniel's sacrifices. No one remembered the long nights or the quiet heroism of a man who had given his life to raise her. To them, he was simply a blemish on a polished surface. The manipulation was not loud, it was insidious. Emily began to feel it during quiet moments when she was alone, while sorting invitations, while looking at seating charts, while trying on her veil in the mirror. A question crept into her heart. Would having him front and center ruin the image she was supposed to present? It was a cruel thought, when she hated herself for entertaining. She loved her father. He had been her anchor, her safe place. But the voices around her painted him as something else entirely. A liability, an embarrassment, a reminder of a past she was meant to outgrow. She noticed how they spoke about him when he wasn't in the room. At a Sunday lunch, plates clattered as an uncle remarked, "Can you imagine him walking her down the aisle in that old suit of his?" The table chuckled, forks tapping like applause. Emily's cheeks burned. She wanted to defend him, to shout that the suit didn't matter, that the man inside it mattered more than all their tailored jackets combined. But her voice caught in her throat. The laughter was too loud, too united. She stayed silent. Her silence haunted her more than their words. Daniel, ever perceptive, sensed the shift. He noticed how Emily grew distracted when he mentioned the wedding, how her smile wavered when he offered to help, how she quickly changed the subject when he asked about rehearsal plans. He didn't confront her. He didn't push. He only gave her space, as he always had. But at night, when she lay awake replaying the whispers, he sat quietly in his own room, turning an old photograph of her in his hands, wondering if he was being written out of a story he had spent his life building. The relatives did not need to shout to be heard. Their whispers carried enough power to bend a daughter's heart against her own truth. And in those weeks before the wedding, Emily found herself caught in a storm of voices, some loud, some quiet, all pushing her toward a choice she never thought she would have to make. A choice between the man who had given her everything and the family who insisted he was worth nothing. The rehearsal hall was buzzing with anticipation. Chairs scraped across polished floors. Voices overlapped in cheerful arrangements. The scent of fresh flowers lingered in the air. For everyone else, it was a time of joy. For Daniel, it was the moment he had been waiting for, an early glimpse of his daughter stepping into her new life. He arrived quietly, his jacket pressed as best as he could manage. His shoes shined, though the leather still bore its years. In his hand, he carried the small invitation Emily had given him weeks earlier, folded neatly. Edges softened from where his thumb had traced it again and again. He walked in, heart thumping, searching for her among the cluster of relatives. And then he saw her, Emily, radiant even in a simple dress, laughing softly with the bridesmaids. His chest swelled. "That's my girl." But as he drew closer, something unsettled him. On the easel at the entrance stood the seating chart, names written in elegant script, each table carefully arranged. He leaned forward, scanning row after row, expecting to see his name near hers, or at least among the family. It wasn't there. He read again, slowly, then faster, eyes darting across the page. Cousins, uncles, aunts, even distant relatives he hadn't spoken to in years, but not him. At last he found it, scribbled low near the end at a table tucked away with acquaintances. Far from the stage, far from her. His throat tightened. For a moment he thought it must be a mistake, a misprint. Surely Emily hadn't seen this. But then he caught sight of his sister-in-law whispering to another guest, her lips curling in that familiar smirk. The look was unmistakable, satisfaction. Daniel stood frozen, the noise of the hall dimming around him. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the rehearsed lines of the officiant all became a distant hum, like waves crashing far away. Inside, only silence. Emily approached him then, her smile gentle but strained. "Daddy, I'm glad you're here." Her voice carried warmth, but her eyes flickered as if searching for words she couldn't quite say. He wanted to ask, "Why am I not by your side? Why is my name buried at the edge of the room like I don't belong? But the words caught in his chest, heavy, unwilling to escape. Instead, he simply nodded. I wouldn't miss it. She squeezed his hand quickly, then was pulled away by another bridesmaid. The moment lasted seconds, yet it carved itself into his soul. Later that evening, he overheard them. Two cousins standing near the refreshment table, voices low but not low enough. It's better this way, one said. Can you imagine him front and center? It would ruin the pictures. The other chuckled. She'll thank us someday. A wedding needs class, not pity. Their laughter stung sharper than any blade. Daniel turned away, his jaw clenched, the air thick and bitter in his lungs. He felt the room closing in, the walls pressing tighter. His vision blurred, not from drink, but from the weight of a truth too cruel to ignore. He had endured humiliation before, at dinners, at gatherings, at countless moments when his worth had been dismissed, but never like this. Never from so close to the one person he thought saw him clearly. His daughter, the child he had carried through fevers, through storms, through nights of hunger, was about to stand before the world, and he was not at her side. It wasn't the absence of honor that broke him. It was the realization that she had let it happen. Whether by choice or by silence, she had allowed others to push him away. He walked outside into the cool evening air. The sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of orange fading into gray. The scent of cut grass mingled with the faint perfume of roses from the hall. He drew in a breath, but it lodged in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt tears well. Not the quiet exhaustion of long nights, not the sting of bills he couldn't pay. This was different. This was heartbreak. A father's place, he thought, is beside his daughter. And yet here he was, standing outside, a guest in his own story. The sound of music drifted from the hall, muffled by the closed doors. Inside, the celebration continued. Rehearsals pressed on, laughter filled the air. Daniel stood in the shadows, unseen. His hand tightened around the folded invitation in his pocket, the paper creased and worn. And in that moment, surrounded by joy that did not include him, his heart cracked in a way that no sacrifice, no labor, no hardship had ever managed to break it before. The hall had emptied, the laughter long faded into the dark. By midnight, the last of the decorations had been boxed, the tables wiped down, the flowers stored in buckets of water to keep their petals alive until morning. Daniel lingered longer than he should have. He told himself he was waiting for a ride, though in truth he simply wasn't ready to go home. His footsteps echoed in the quiet corridors, the sound hollow against the walls. Outside, the night was cool, the street lamps casting halos of yellow light across the pavement. He walked slowly toward the side of the building where voices drifted into the silence. At first he thought they belonged to strangers, but as he drew nearer, hiding himself in the shadow of an oak tree, the words grew clearer, the tones familiar. They were family. She made the right call, one voice murmured, sharp even in its softness. Can you imagine him standing next to the groom's father? The photographs would be ruined before they were even printed. A low chuckle followed. Another voice joined, smoother, colder. She's smart. Distance herself now before she gets tied down with his baggage. A wedding should be about beginnings, not about dragging the past into the spotlight. Daniel froze. The night air pressed heavy against his chest, the smell of damp earth rising after a late drizzle. He could hear every syllable as though the words were carved straight into him. A third voice chimed in, hushed but merciless. I just hope he knows to stay quiet during the ceremony. One slip, one awkward moment, and people will never forget. Poor Emily. She's worked too hard to let him pull her back down. They spoke of him as though he were a burden, a stain that might spread if not contained. Each word was a blade, slipping between ribs he thought had long since hardened against pain. Daniel pressed his palm against the rough bark of the oak, grounding himself. The texture bit into his skin, anchoring him while his heart threatened to tear free. The voices dipped lower, a conspiratorial whisper. Between us, I don't even know why she still keeps him around. Gratitude, maybe, but gratitude fades. She'll see once she starts her own family. Some ties are better cut. The words struck harder than any insult before, not because they came from strangers, but because they came from blood, people who should have known the truth of what he had given, what he had lost. He wanted to step out, to confront them, to shout that every scar on his hands was proof of love, that every gray hair on his head was earned in her name. But his voice caught, swallowed by the darkness. So he stayed hidden, letting their poison spill unchecked into the night. When at last the group dispersed, their laughter fading into the distance, Daniel remained where he stood. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers themselves. It was the silence of knowing nothing he could say would change what they believed. Above him the branches swayed, their leaves rustling softly. A night bird called in the distance, lonely, unanswered. He leaned back against the tree, closing his eyes. Images flickered. Emily's first steps across the living room carpet, the night she clutched his hand after a nightmare, the way she once rested her head on his shoulder during long bus rides. All of it now felt fragile, like glass underfoot. Inside the hall, faint light still glowed through a window. He saw her silhouette move across the room, her dress trailing as she spoke with friends. She looked happy, radiant, a bride-to-be untethered by the shadows outside. For a moment he wished he could step back into that world, into her light, untouched by the venom of others. But the gulf between them felt wider than ever. He turned away, the gravel crunching softly under his shoes. The night air was cool, but he felt heat behind his eyes. He blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. He had promised himself long ago that Emily would never see him break, never see the weight he carried. But alone, beneath the indifferent stars, the cracks spread. He whispered into the emptiness, barely audible even to himself. Am I nothing more than their shadow? Am I nothing more than shame? The wind moved through the trees, offering no answer. And Daniel walked into the darkness, each step heavier than the last, carrying with him the sting of words not meant for his ears, yet impossible to forget. Daniel returned home that night in near silence, the streets empty but for the glow of traffic lights cycling through colors with no cars to command. His footsteps echoed faintly on the cracked sidewalk, a lonely rhythm that seemed to underline every word he had overheard. The apartment was dark when he entered. He did not bother turning on the light. He hung his jacket on the chair, loosened the knot of his tie, and sat down at the table. The wood was scratched, worn by years of meals and homework assignments, but it was steady beneath his elbows. On the surface lay the stack of envelopes he had avoided earlier, bills, notices, statements. He brushed them aside and reached instead for a drawer at the bottom of the cabinet. From it, he pulled an old box. The cardboard edges had softened with age, the tape yellowing, but it held what he needed. Inside were fragments of a life, receipts folded neatly, medical statements, tuition slips, every scrap of paper that told the story no one else wanted to see. He sifted through them slowly, each page rustling like a whisper from the past. His hands lingered on one, a faded hospital invoice. Emily's name printed in bold across the top, the date from when she was barely a year old. He could still recall the night, the terror of her fever, the sterile sting of antiseptic, the relief when she finally opened her eyes again. Another slip bore the emblem of her elementary school, a receipt for a field trip she had begged to join. He remembered working an extra shift to cover it, arriving home too late to tuck her in but leaving the envelope on the counter so she would see it in the morning. Page after page, memory after memory. Each number, each date, each sum carried the weight of his devotion. He sat back, the papers spread before him like pieces of evidence. For years, he had carried this story in silence, letting others believe what they wanted. Pride had kept him quiet. Dignity had made him endure. But now, as he thought of Emily walking down the aisle, guided not by the father who had carried her but by the image others wanted to present, he felt a shift inside. The humiliation, the whispers, the laughter, they no longer mattered. What mattered was the truth, and the truth had to be seen. The decision came not with fury but with clarity. He would not argue. He would not beg for his place. He would not shout against the voices that had painted him as less. Instead, he would let the years speak for themselves. Those receipts, those slips of paper, they were not just transactions. They were proof of nights without sleep, of days without meals, of dreams sacrificed quietly. They were the story no photograph could tell. He imagined placing them gently on the table during the reception, unfolding them one by one, not as an act of revenge but as a declaration. This is who I am. This is what a father is. The clock ticked past 2 in the morning. Outside, the hum of the city softened into a rare stillness. Daniel leaned back, staring at the ceiling, his chest heavy yet strangely lighter than before. For the first time in weeks, he felt no need to defend himself. The decision had been made, not in anger but in resolve. He thought of Emily, her smile when she was little, the way she used to press her forehead against his after a long day. He thought of her now, grown, torn between loyalty and pressure, love and appearances. He would not confront her with accusations. He would not burden her with guilt. He would show her only the truth and let her choose what to do with it. Rising from the table, he carefully gathered the papers back into the box. His movements were deliberate, reverent, as though handling something sacred. He slid the lid shut and placed it on the counter where morning light would find it. Before heading to bed, he stood at the window looking out across the sleeping neighborhood. The air was cool against the glass, the stars faint but steady above. He whispered, not to himself this time, but as if sending the words upward into the night. Let them see. Let her see. Then he turned away, his decision sealed not by noise but by silence. The morning of the wedding broke clear and bright, as if the sky itself had been polished for the occasion. The church bells rang out across the town, each toll echoing with a kind of ceremonial gravity. Cars lined the street in neat rows, doors slamming shut as guests stepped out in pressed suits and pastel dresses. The air smelled of perfume and fresh-cut flowers, mingling with the faint sweetness of the bakery deliveries brought in for the reception. Inside, the sanctuary glowed. White ribbons curled along the pews, candles flickered at the altar, and the scent of roses filled every breath. Conversations rippled like a tide as people greeted one another, hugs exchanged, compliments on dresses and jewelry whispered over the music of the string quartet. At the center of it all stood Emily. She was radiant, draped in ivory silk, her veil catching the light with every small movement. The room turned toward her as if she carried the sun in her hands. Smiles bloomed on every face. Cameras lifted, capturing the moment. And yet beneath the glittering surface there was a shadow. When the doors opened for the bridal procession, the guests rose as one. The music swelled, violins lifting in triumph, the notes cascading down the vaulted ceiling. Bridesmaids moved first, their dresses swaying, bouquets clutched tightly. Then the groom, waiting at the altar, straightened his tie, his eyes fixed on Emily. But when she appeared at the threshold, walking forward alone, a murmur stirred among the pews. Whispers fluttered like restless birds. Where's her father? Isn't he supposed to walk her down? Maybe he wasn't invited. The questions grew quiet but insistent, threads of doubt weaving through the beauty of the ceremony. Emily's steps faltered just for a heartbeat. Her eyes flickered toward the seats where family was gathered. The groom's parents smiled warmly, his mother clutching her pearls. Her own relatives beamed with approval, proud of the picture-perfect scene they had orchestrated. But the one chair that mattered most was empty. Daniel had chosen not to come early, not to walk her in. He had stayed behind, letting the day unfold as the family wished. The suit he had pressed still hung in his apartment closet. The box of receipts and papers remained waiting on the counter. He told himself it was better this way for her, that his presence would only bring discomfort, whispers, a stain on the flawless portrait they wanted. And so, while Emily moved slowly down the aisle to the sound of music, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table, the low buzz of the radiator filling the silence where his heartbeat seemed too loud. Back in the church, the ceremony pressed forward. Emily reached the altar, her hands trembling as she placed them in the groom's. The officiant spoke words of blessing, congregation echoing amen in practiced harmony. Rings glimmered, vows were recited, laughter broke when a line stumbled. On the surface it was perfect, but in the back of the room among the rows of guests a different kind of conversation flickered. I heard she didn't want him up front. Smart choice. Can you imagine the pictures? Still, it feels strange. A wedding without a father. The comments were quick, hushed, but they left their mark. People shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the empty space, the missing figure. Emily's smile wavered once, only for a second. The string quartet played on, masking the ache beneath her ribs. She glanced toward the back of the church as though half expecting to see him standing quietly there, hands folded, eyes shining with pride. But there was no one. Only the double doors shut against the morning sun. The kiss sealed the vows, applause filling the sanctuary, guests rising to their feet. Cameras flashed, petals scattered from the balconies above. To all appearances it was a triumph. Yet even as cheers rang out, the silence of absence clung stubbornly. A wedding is meant to join two families. But to Emily, as she turned and walked back down the aisle with her new husband, the echo of her footsteps seemed too loud. Each step carried the unspoken truth. Someone was missing. Someone who should have been at her side. someone who had given her everything. And his absence, though unacknowledged, was louder than any celebration around her. The reception hall glimmered with light. Chandeliers rained gold across the tables, glasses clinked in steady rhythm, and the air swelled with the hum of laughter. Plates of roasted chicken and seasoned vegetables filled the tables, the scent of butter and herbs mingling with sweet vanilla from the wedding cake waiting at the center. Emily moved among the guests, her hand looped through her husband's arm, her smile practiced and bright. Everyone told her she looked radiant, glowing, unforgettable. She nodded, accepted the compliments, posed for photographs. But inside, a small hollow had already begun to spread. At first, she thought she could carry it, that if she just kept moving, kept smiling, the emptiness would fade beneath the noise of celebration. But then a guest, a kindly old neighbor who had known her since childhood, reached for her hand. "My dear," the woman said softly, "you look so beautiful today. Your mother would be proud, and your father, where is he? I thought he would be by your side." The words were gentle without malice, yet they struck like a bell in a quiet room, reverberating through her chest. Emily's breath caught, her smile faltered. For a moment the chandeliers above seemed too bright, the perfume cloying in her nose, the music too loud. She whispered, he's not here." And the truth of it split her heart open. She excused herself quickly, retreating toward a corner of the hall where the music softened into a distant thrum. Her hands trembled as she lifted the veil slightly, trying to steady her breath. But the tears came anyway. Not the delicate kind brides sometimes shed for joy, but heavy, breaking sobs that shook her shoulders. She pressed her hand against her mouth, as if she could hold the sound in, but the ache was too deep. All around her, life went on. Guests toasted with champagne, children laughed near the dessert table, the band struck up another song. Yet in her corner, hidden just out of sight, Emily felt the weight of years pressing down. Images rushed at her unbidden. Her father's steady figure waiting by the school gates, the nights he stayed awake to help her finish projects, the quiet mornings when he packed her lunch before rushing to work. And now, on the day she needed him most, she had let others convince her he was better left unseen. Her chest ached with regret. One of her bridesmaids noticed and hurried over, concern flickering across her face. "Emily, are you all right? Do you need water?" Emily shook her head, unable to form words. She dabbed at her cheeks with a handkerchief, smearing her makeup. The bridesmaid tried to fix the veil, but the damage wasn't in the fabric, it was in her heart. She whispered finally, her voice cracking, "I should have had him here, right next to me. I should have never let them push him away." The bridesmaid hesitated, unsure how to respond. There was no easy comfort to offer. Across the hall her relatives laughed, raising glasses, unaware or unwilling to notice the bride's absence from the glow of the celebration. Emily caught sight of them through her tears, their smiles wide, their voices carrying over the music. And in that instant she realized whose voices had shaped this day into something incomplete. Her stomach twisted. She turned away, closing her eyes, her tears hot against her skin. Then, faintly, she thought she heard his voice, not real but in memory. "Let it go, sweetheart. Some things aren't worth the fight." But now she wondered if this was the one fight that was worth everything. Her sobs softened into quiet tears, the kind that left her shoulders trembling but her eyes fierce. For beneath the sorrow, regret had already begun to transform into something else, an ache for truth, a longing for her father's presence that could no longer be silenced. The night was still young. The reception had only begun. And though her heart was breaking, she knew this moment would not be the end of it. It was only the beginning. Across town, in his small apartment, a father lifted the plain cardboard box from the counter, tucked it under his arm, and stepped into the night on his way to the only place he still hoped to be seen. The reception was in full bloom when the doors at the far end of the hall creaked open. He had gone home first, changed nothing, and simply picked up the box that had waited for years. The music did not stop. Laughter carried on. At first, no one noticed the figure stepping inside. Daniel walked slowly, his shoulders squared though his suit was modest, the faint sheen of wear at the cuffs catching the chandelier's glow. In his hands he carried a simple box, the cardboard plain against the glitter of the celebration. Emily saw him before anyone else. Her breath hitched. Her glass trembled in her hand. The weight of regret she had carried through the evening surged forward. The whispers began almost instantly. "What's he doing here? Did someone invite him? Look, he's carrying something." But Daniel said nothing. He walked past the rows of relatives, past the carefully decorated tables, past the cousins whose laughter faltered as he drew near. His steps echoed against the polished floor, each one steady, deliberate. When he reached the head table, he stopped. The music faltered as the quartet's bows stilled, the melody hanging unfinished in the air. Conversations dwindled into silence. All eyes turned toward him. Daniel set the box gently on the table in front of Emily. For a moment, no one moved. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, with hands that did not shake, he lifted the lid. Inside lay the pages of a lifetime: receipts, hospital bills, tuition slips, grocery invoices. He drew the first one out, a faded hospital statement, and held it up for all to see. "This," he said, his voice low but carrying, "was the night she almost slipped away from me. She was barely a year old. I worked double shifts for months to pay this so she could open her eyes again." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some leaned forward, squinting at the paper in disbelief. He pulled another slip. A tuition bill, the ink smudged at the edges from years of folding. "And this, her first year of college. She was so proud. I told her she wouldn't have to worry about a thing. I took on every extra hour the warehouse would give me. I sold the guitar I had played since I was a boy, also she could walk into those classrooms with her head held high." Emily pressed a hand to her mouth, her tears flowing freely now. One by one, he laid the documents on the table, the stack growing like a monument to years no one else had seen. Each page carried its own story. The braces that fixed her smile, the shoes bought 2 sizes too big so she could grow into them, the late payments and overdraft fees that carved his pride but never touched her joy. The room was silent. The only sound was the faint rustle of paper, the quiet tremor in Daniel's voice. "I never asked for recognition," he said. "I never asked for thanks, but I will not allow lies to erase what has been done." He looked directly at the relatives who had whispered against him, their faces pale under the lights. "You said I would embarrass her, that I would ruin this day. But tell me, what ruins a day more? A man who gave everything for his daughter, or a family that teaches her to be ashamed of him?" The words cut through the silence like a blade. No one answered. Emily rose to her feet, her veil trembling as she moved. She reached out, taking the hospital bill from his hand with shaking fingers. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Daddy, I didn't know you kept all of these." Daniel turned to her then, his eyes soft, his expression steady. "You weren't supposed to know. You were just supposed to live, to smile, to have the life your mother walked away from. That was my promise." Her sob broke through the stillness, raw and uncontained. She clutched the papers to her chest, then flung her arms around him, burying her face against his shoulder. The crowd watched, some shifting uncomfortably, others wiping at their own eyes. The cousins who had laughed now lowered their gazes, their smugness dissolved into shame. The groom's parents exchanged glances, no trace of judgment left, only quiet respect. Daniel held his daughter close, his hand resting gently on the back of her head. His voice was low, meant only for her, but the room was so quiet that everyone heard. "You don't have to apologize, you just have to remember." And with those words, the truth, undeniable, unshakable, stood revealed, not in anger but in love. For a long moment, no one moved. The papers lay scattered across the head table, a fragile testimony in faded ink and yellowed edges. Emily clung to her father, her sobs muffled against his shoulder, and around them the air thickened into something almost tangible. Silence. Not the gentle hush of reverence, but the sharp, suffocating stillness of a truth too heavy to be ignored. The string quartet had lowered their bows, instruments resting useless in their laps. Waiters froze near the doorway, trays balanced midair. Guests sat motionless, their champagne glasses untouched, the fizz long gone flat. Even the chandeliers seemed to flicker less brightly, as though the room itself had paused to listen. Daniel did not speak further. He stood quietly, his hand resting on his daughter's back, his face calm but resolute. It was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a man who had finally placed the weight of his life where it belonged, before the eyes that had once refused to see. The relatives who had whispered were the first to avert their gaze. One cousin stared fixedly at her napkin, twisting it until it tore. An uncle shifted in his seat, the creak of the chair echoing embarrassingly loud. The aunt who had spoken of appearances dabbed at her forehead with a tissue, though the hall was not warm. Their laughter from earlier hours now hung in the air like smoke after a fire, acrid and undeniable. The groom's parents exchanged glances, their polished composure shaken. His father cleared his throat, but no words followed. His mother pressed a hand to her pearls as though steadying herself. For all their quiet wealth and dignity, they too understood the gravity of what had unfolded. Among the guests, some wept openly. Others simply bowed their heads as if ashamed of having believed the whispers without question. A murmur rose and quickly died, no one daring to break the silence too soon. At the center of it all, Emily lifted her face. Mascara streaked her cheeks, her veil clung damp to her skin, but her eyes shone fierce, unguarded. She looked around the hall, her voice raw when it came. "You don't know him, you never did. You saw his clothes, his hands, his silence, and you thought that was all he was. But this—" She lifted one of the papers from the table, holding it high, her hand trembling. "This is my father. Every line, every number, every sacrifice. He gave everything so I could stand here today." The words broke the stillness like a stone through glass. Yet no one spoke against her. No one dared. Daniel placed a gentle hand on hers, lowering the paper. His voice, when it finally came, was soft but steady. "I don't need anyone's approval. I never did. I only needed her to know she was loved." His words sank into the room, heavy and clear. From the back of the hall, a guest began to clap, slow, tentative. Then another joined. Soon the sound spread, awkward at first, then gathering strength, until the hall filled with applause. Not the raucous cheer of celebration, but the solemn acknowledgement of truth revealed. The relatives who had mocked him did not join. Their hands stayed still, their faces stiff. But the sound drowned them out, each clap another nail sealing the coffin of their arrogance. Emily turned again to her father, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I let them make me doubt. I let them take you from the place you deserve to be." Daniel shook his head gently. "No, sweetheart, you can't take me from where I've always been, right here." He touched his chest, then placed his hand over hers. "Right here." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they carried something more than sorrow, something like release. The applause faded into quiet once more, but it was not the same silence as before. It was softer now, reverent, heavy with a new awareness. No one dared look at Daniel as they had before. No one could. The room had shifted, its axis realigned. And in that quiet, the man once dismissed, once whispered about, stood not as an embarrassment but as undeniable truth, etched in paper, in sacrifice, and in the heart of the daughter who finally saw. Emily still clutched her father's hand, her breath uneven, her chest rising and falling as though she had run a great distance. The applause had died down, yet the energy in the hall remained thick, fragile, waiting for what might happen next. Her eyes searched his face, and what she saw there undid her completely, not pride, not triumph, but the same quiet love that had followed her since childhood. No bitterness, no accusation, only him. Her knees buckled before her mind could stop them. The silk of her gown rustled as she sank to the floor, veil spilling forward like a white curtain. Gasps broke across the hall. Guests leaned forward, chairs creaking, hands flying to mouths. A bride kneeling before her father, not her groom, was something no one had expected. But Emily did not hear them. She clasped his hands between her own, pressing her forehead against his knuckles. The salt of her tears dampened his skin. Her voice shook as it broke through the silence. "Daddy, I'm so sorry." The words were raw, unpolished, wrung straight from her heart. They filled the air heavier than any speech rehearsed for the occasion. "I let them tell me you weren't enough. I let their voices drown out everything you gave me. I should have fought for you. I should have stood beside you." Her shoulders trembled, the gown pooling around her on the floor. She was no longer the radiant bride poised for photographs. She was a daughter undone, reaching back through the years to the man who had carried her. Daniel bent down quickly, trying to lift her up, but she resisted, shaking her head. Her grip tightened on his hands as if to anchor herself there at his feet before the eyes of everyone who had doubted him. "I can't stand tall," she whispered fiercely. "Not until you know, not until they know, I am who I am because of you." Tears blurred her vision, yet she felt the roughness of his hands against her palms, the warmth of them grounding her. It was the same warmth that had soothed her nightmares, tied her shoes, carried her across streets when her legs were too small to keep up. The hall remained still, the only sounds the distant hum of the chandelier lights and the occasional sniffle from a guest overcome with emotion. Even the relatives who had once mocked Daniel now sat rigid, caught between shame and disbelief. unable to meet the gaze of the bride, kneeling before the man they had scorned. Daniel leaned lower, his voice gentle, his eyes shimmering though he fought against tears. "Emily," he said softly, "you don't kneel for me, you never have to. I raised you so you would stand tall, stronger than me, braver than me. That's all I ever wanted." But she shook her head, her veil trembling with emotion. "No, Daddy, tonight I need the world to see who you are. I need them to see what I see, what I should have never forgotten." Her words cracked on the last syllable, throat burning with the force of it. Then slowly Daniel slipped his hands beneath her arms and lifted her to her feet. She rose reluctantly, her gown heavy, her eyes searching his as though she were a child again. He brushed a strand of hair from her damp cheek, his thumb tracing away the tears. "You don't have to prove anything," he murmured. "Not to them, not to me. I knew who you were from the moment you opened your eyes in that hospital room, and I never stopped knowing." Her lips quivered, her chest heaving, but in his words she felt something loosen, a knot inside her finally give way. The guests sat in stunned silence, many with tears streaking their own cheeks. It was no longer just a wedding reception, it was a reckoning, a confession, a homecoming. Emily turned to face the room, her father's hand in hers. Her voice, though soft, carried across the hall. "This is my father, and there is no honor greater than being his daughter." The words landed like a final stone dropped into still water, rippling outward until even the furthest corner of the hall felt their weight. Daniel stood beside her silent, his presence finally undeniable, and for the first time the world around them did not diminish him. It bowed to the truth. For years they had spoken with certainty. At dinners, in phone calls, in the shadows of family gatherings, they had painted Daniel as a man unworthy of respect. Their words had dripped with condescension, laced with smirks and knowing nods. But now, in the glow of the chandeliers and beneath the gaze of every guest present, those same relatives could not raise their eyes. One by one, they shifted in their seats. A cousin who had laughed loudest at his old suit now stared fixedly at the floor, her fork turning circles on an untouched plate. An uncle who had once declared Daniel a lost cause rubbed his hands together, the skin of his knuckles pale with pressure, as though trying to scrub away his own guilt. The aunt who had whispered most venomously pressed her lips into a thin line, her gaze darting toward the doors as though escape might spare her the weight of this moment. But there was no escape. Not here. Not tonight. The silence pressed in on them, thicker than the applause that had filled the hall minutes earlier. It was not the silence of indifference, but of reckoning. They felt the sting of their own words coming back to them, echoing against the evidence Daniel had laid bare, the bills, the records, the sacrifices inked in numbers that no denial could erase. Every rustle of paper on the head table was a reminder. Every tear on Emily's cheeks was an indictment. Emily stood tall now, her father's hand in hers, her voice still trembling from emotion but carrying the strength of conviction. She looked directly at the family who had tried to erase him. "You wanted me to believe he wasn't enough," she said, her words deliberate, each syllable steady. "But it was you who were blind. You measured his worth in money, in appearances, in things that vanish. I measure his worth in love, and in that he has given me more than all of you combined." Her declaration cut through the hall like a blade. The relatives flinched, their shame written not in words but in bowed heads and unsteady hands. The groom's family remained silent, their expressions solemn but not unkind. They, too, seemed to understand that they were witnessing not a scandal but a revelation, one that drew a sharp line between those who loved truly and those who judged falsely. Guests from outside the family glanced at one another, their sympathy clear. Some shook their heads at the relatives, disappointment etched into their faces. Others whispered softly, not about Daniel, but about the cruelty of those who had tried to bury him. Daniel himself did not gloat. He did not need to. He stood quietly, his posture calm, his presence steady. The shame of others was not his victory, it was theirs to bear. Yet the room had shifted. Where once he had been the target of smirks, now those who had mocked him shrank into themselves, their power dissolved under the weight of truth. A cousin finally tried to speak. His voice cracked as he muttered, "We only wanted what was best for her." But even as the words left his lips, they sounded hollow, brittle, breaking under the strain of reality. Emily turned her gaze to him, her eyes sharp with the clarity of a woman who had been deceived but no longer. "What was best for me," she said quietly, "was the man who never left me, the man who never asked for thanks, the man you taught me to be ashamed of. That will be your burden, not mine." The cousin lowered his head again, unable to meet her eyes. Around the hall, the weight of those words spread like a tide. Relatives shifted uncomfortably, adjusting napkins, sipping water they did not need, pretending to busy themselves with details that no longer mattered. Their silence was louder than any argument they could muster. And above it all, Daniel remained still, his daughter's hand clasped in his, the truth no longer hidden, no longer denied. The chandeliers glowed brighter now, or perhaps it only seemed that way, as though the light itself had chosen a side. And in that glow, the relatives bowed, not in reverence, not in respect, but in shame too heavy to conceal. The hall was still heavy with silence when Daniel finally drew a breath and looked out at the faces before him, some wet with tears, some turned downward in shame, others simply waiting, holding themselves still, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile moment. Emily's hand was still in his, her grip firm, her eyes never leaving his face. She seemed to fear that if she looked away, he might vanish into the crowd, or worse, into the shadows where they had once tried to place him. Daniel cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was low but carried easily, the way only truth can. "I never wanted this night to be about me," he began. "This was her day, her joy, her new beginning. But sometimes life does not let us stay silent forever." He paused, glancing at the papers spread across the table, the fragments of a lifetime he had never intended to show. He touched one lightly with the tip of his finger before letting it rest again. "I raised my daughter with one promise," he continued, "that she would never feel abandoned, that no matter what the world told her about her mother leaving, about me not being enough, she would always know someone stood with her. That was my vow." His gaze lifted, meeting the eyes of those seated closest. For once, none of them looked away. "I was never rich. I was never polished. I did not have the kind of success you could measure with titles or cars or houses. But every hour I worked, every dollar I saved, every meal I went without was so she could step into this life unbroken." The hall was utterly still. Even the air seemed to lean closer to hear. He turned slightly, addressing not just Emily but the room itself. "Family is not measured by blood alone. Blood is an accident. What makes a family is presence, sacrifice, the willingness to lose yourself so another can thrive." His words hung there, simple but immovable. "I know some of you believed appearances mattered more, that dignity was found in wealth or in reputation. But dignity is not what the world gives you. It is what you refuse to take away from others. And if you must know who I am a man who chose my daughter over myself every day of my life. I would do it again, without hesitation." Emily's tears spilled anew, her shoulders trembling. Daniel reached up, brushing her cheek gently with his thumb, his touch steady despite the weight of the moment. "Sweetheart," he said softly, his voice breaking just enough to reveal the depth beneath it, "you never needed to carry my name with pride. You only needed to carry your own life with love, and you have, more beautifully than I ever dreamed." Her lips quivered. She whispered back, "I only stand here because of you." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard, then turned once more to the hall. "If there is one thing I want you all to remember," he said, "it is this. Sacrifice without love is bitterness, but sacrifice with love, that is what builds a life. And love is the only wealth that cannot be stolen, cannot be mocked, cannot be erased." The weight of his words pressed into the air, settling over every guest. Some shifted in their chairs, some bowed their heads, others simply stared, unable to look away. He let out a long breath, as though releasing years of silence all at once. Then, with a small, almost tired smile, he concluded, "Let this night be hers. Let her be free of whispers, of shame, of judgment. And let her walk into tomorrow knowing what I always knew, that she is loved beyond measure. That has been and will always be my only gift." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Emily collapsed into his arms, her sob muffled against his chest. The hall, too overcome to remain still, broke into applause once more, not polite, not rehearsed, but raw, rising like a wave that swept through the room. Daniel held her close, his eyes closing briefly as though offering a silent prayer. And though the celebration would continue, though music and laughter would return, nothing in that hall would ever be the same again. Because the Father had spoken, and his final message had settled into every heart that heard it. The applause would not stop. It rolled through the hall in waves, rising and falling, echoing against the high ceilings, carrying with it something far greater than celebration. It carried release, recognition, a truth too long ignored finally finding its voice. Daniel stood, still holding Emily close. He felt her shoulders tremble against him, not with shame, not with hesitation, but with the weight of emotion too vast for words. Her tears were no longer only sorrow, they were gratitude, a flood of love pouring out after years of silence. Guests began to rise from their seats, not waiting for any signal. Some clapped through tears, their faces streaked with mascara or flushed with emotion. Others simply stood in stunned reverence, hands pressed together as though in prayer. Even the groom, who had until then remained uncertain of how to bridge the gap between his bride and her father, moved forward. He placed his hand gently on Daniel's shoulder, his voice quiet but steady. "Sir, I see her differently now. And I see you. I promise you I will honor her as you have, with every sacrifice, with every choice. I will not take her for granted." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, a small gesture but heavy with meaning. At the tables, the relatives who had once whispered now sat stiff, their shame impossible to disguise. Some kept their heads lowered, unable to meet the eyes of others. Some dabbed at tears that were not grief but guilt. For them, the night was no longer about the beauty of a wedding. It was about being confronted with the poverty of their own hearts. But Daniel did not look their way. He did not need to. Tonight was not about revenge. It was about truth. And the truth was already louder than anything they could have said. Emily finally pulled back from her father, her cheeks damp, her veil clinging to her skin. She turned to the room, her voice breaking but determined. "Do you see him now?" she asked, not to shame, not to accuse, but to awaken. "This man gave up everything for me, and I let others convince me he wasn't enough. But I will never make that mistake again, because tonight I remember what really matters. Not wealth, not appearances, but love that never leaves." Her words trembled, but the conviction beneath them was unshakable. "This is my father, and I am proud to be his daughter." The room answered not with words but with another surge of applause, louder than before, as if every clap was a confession, a plea for forgiveness, a vow to do better in their own lives. Daniel raised his hand gently, asking for quiet. His voice was steady when he spoke, but softer now, intimate, as though he wanted his words to settle deep into the hearts before him. "Do not wait until the chair is empty to honor the one who raised you. Do not wait until the voice is gone to remember its wisdom. If you have a father, a mother, someone who gave their life so you could live yours, see them now. Thank them now. Love them now." He looked at Emily, then at the guests, his eyes glistening but strong. Because family is not who shares your blood. It is who shares your burden, who carries you when you cannot carry yourself. That is the only inheritance that matters. The hall was still again, but this time it was not silence born of shame. It was reverence. When the music returned, it was softer. No longer the triumphant swell of violins, but a gentle melody, as though the instruments themselves understood they were playing not just for a wedding, but for something eternal. Guests began to move again, hugging one another, wiping eyes, whispering quiet promises to call their parents, to reconcile with their children, to remember the love they had forgotten. And though the reception would continue, though laughter and dance would return, the night would always be remembered for this. A father, a daughter, and the truth revealed in a box of faded receipts. Emily held her father's hand through the rest of the evening. She did not let go. Not when they cut the cake. Not when she danced with her new husband. And especially not when she asked softly, "Will you dance with me, Daddy?" He hesitated, embarrassed by the thought of his stiff steps on such a grand floor, but she insisted. And as the music swayed, she rested her head against his chest, the same way she had as a child, and whispered so only he could hear, "You will never stand in the shadows again." And that, dear listener, is where the story leaves us. Not in the glitter of chandeliers, not in the polish of gowns and speeches, but in the raw, undeniable truth that the quiet sacrifices of love are worth more than the loudest applause of society. This story is not just about Daniel and Emily. It is about all of us. It asks, have we forgotten the hands that raised us? Have we measured worth in the wrong places, money, reputation, appearance, while overlooking the quiet devotion that gave us life? In today's world, it is easy to get lost in comparison, to scroll through images of success, of wealth, of beauty, and to feel that we or those who raised us do not measure up. But worth cannot be measured in likes or salaries or titles. Worth is in the late nights someone stayed awake to care for you. Worth is in the meals skipped so you could eat. Worth is in the hand that held yours when no one else would. And if you still have someone in your life who has given you that kind of love, do not wait. Call them, thank them, hug them, show them that you see them, because one day you will wish you had. Thank you, my dear friends, for listening to this story. If it touched you, if it reminded you of your own father, your mother, or anyone who has sacrificed for you, share it. Let others feel what you have felt. And if you want to continue hearing stories that remind us of love, family, and the truths that outlive us all, please subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these stories alive, and it means more than I can ever say. I wish you health. I wish you joy. And above all, I wish you a family that, whether by blood or by choice, gives you the love that makes life worth living. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.